Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Rotary Club of Seattle, the fourth oldest and one of the largest Rotary clubs in the world. It's great to have you here on a Wednesday. We've got a great program which honors our veterans today. So what an honor to have all of you, and especially our veterans and our veteran members who are here today. So we will begin with a little inspiration. Please welcome Reverend Jeff Gill for our invocation today. Jeff?
We held an election yesterday, which is a reminder to us all of the rights, privileges, and duties that we as citizens should never take for granted. This is also the week when we observe Veterans Day, the focus of our program today here. Veterans Day has its origins in the events that took place at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, bringing to close World War I. It was established by an act of Congress in 1938 that made the 11th of November in each year a legal holiday, a day to be dedicated to the cause of world peace and to be thereafter celebrated and known as Armistice Day. And in 1954, the name was changed to Veterans Day in order to honor all veterans, and not just those who had died in World War I. In the spirit of these two important events this week, I invite you to join with me in prayer. Blessed are you, God of all creation, who calls us into communion and fellowship with you and with one another. On this day after an election, we are mindful of the importance of our participation in the building of a more just and peaceable society. Bless those whom we elect to public office with wisdom, grace, and compassion for all whom they serve. And help us all to do our part to defend our liberties, uphold justice for all people, and guard the institutions that enable us all to flourish. Give us courage in these uncertain times to persevere in the conviction that we are all created in your image, have equal dignity and value, and deserve the opportunity to live into the dream you have for us. And in this week when we observe Veterans Day, help us to so honor and respect those who for our sakes take on the duties of serving and defending our nation, often at great personal sacrifice. And may we all be inspired through their example to offer our lives in the service of others. And even as Veterans Day came into being to celebrate the laying down of arms at the beginning of a great and terrible war, may we also honor those who have served our country by working for the day when, as the prophet Isaiah says, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And until that day comes, give us the resolve to honor those who serve in the armed forces with our respect and gratitude, with care for those who are wounded in body, mind, or spirit, and with a commitment to serve one another in deeper bonds of love and community. These things we pray in your most holy name. Amen.
Today's program is about honoring our veterans. Our country has, well, let's just call it a spotty record when it comes to honoring those Americans who have served our country in uniform. Racism on many fronts for many decades denied many veterans the honor they deserve. I can't imagine what they must have felt like to sign up to defend our country only to be treated as second-class citizens during and after war. Politics kept many of our veterans from feeling appreciated, and in fact, it caused ungrateful Americans to ridicule, even despise, those in uniform who risked their lives and lost their friends and fought for us. For them, I can't imagine what that must have felt like either. So today we get a history lesson from some remarkable veterans. Some of them are members in this room who have lived this history and deserve our thanks and our deepest gratitude. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Lori Matsukawa from King 5. Lori is the perfect moderator for today's program. She literally has worked for decades as a journalist to shed light on the Japanese-American experience, to bring about understanding, to bring about truth to one of our country's darkest chapters of our history. And I'm turning the rest of today's program over to our member, retired General Jimmy Collins. General Collins has served as in a distinguished military career. He retired in 2006 after serving as the 1st Corps Deputy Commanding General and Chief of Staff. Jimmy also worked at Weyerhaeuser as a Vice President of Procurement. He currently is the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, which is an unpaid position, but essentially Jimmy is the eyes and ears of the Secretary of the Army for the state of Washington. It's an incredible honor to have Jimmy in our club serving in that capacity. Jimmy is also passionate about connecting veterans with the business world and has a leadership and consulting company called Jimmy Collins and Associates. So please welcome our member, General Jimmy Collins. Thank you, sir. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's truly my honor and privilege to be with you today to introduce this program. The intent is to highlight local individuals who have honorably served our nation in uniform. And I'd like to start by asking those of you that have served, as I call the name of the service which you wore a uniform for, I'd like for you to stand. Now, there are actually 7 uniform services, but we'll start with those that most folks know. How about soldiers? If you served in the United States Army, would you please stand? Thank you. Let's move next to sailors, the United States Navy. How about airmen, those that have served in the United States Air Force? Marines, hoo-ah! United States Coast Guard. We'll still give them a hand. We've got great coasties here in the neighborhood. How about the United States Public Health Service? Small but mighty. Or NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. For many years, the West Coast NOAA headquarters was right here in Seattle. Well, those folks in your midst deserve your respect, and we thank you. I'd like to ask Lori and Dale if they would come up and please take your seats. Our short program segment today is focused on a group known as the Nisei Veterans Committee. The NVC is a local veteran service organization for Japanese Americans who, at the advent of Pearl Harbor, they were forced out of their homes and businesses by presidential order and sent to, many of those here in Seattle went to what's now the Puyallup Fairgrounds, and then were transshipped on to other barbed wire enclosures for the duration of the war. Some of you have read the book, At the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, that is a terrific rendition of what was going on in the nation at that time. You might imagine that those who were so ordered were dismayed, but I've learned that their dismay was turned into perseverance, and many of them fought to get into the armed forces to take care of their country. And as it turns out, the armed forces did agree, and we'll learn about some of their heroic service. But after they returned from war, they were unable to join other veteran service organizations. I would attribute that to racism, and it was disappointing, but again, they persevered and created their own organization down at 12th and Jackson in our international district, and the Nisei Veterans Committee it continues today. As a group, nationally, they received the Congressional Gold Medal to thank them for their service in 2017, and our own moderator, Lori Matsukawa, was the co-MC that day, and that's where Lori and I had a chance to look at each other. I was privileged to present Bronze Stars to some of them who had earned them but were not received until that day. So Dale Kaku, who's a past commander, a former soldier, is here to tell us a little bit about their story. And we are privileged, as Mark indicated, to have King 5 news anchor and colleague from King 5, Lori Matsukawa, to narrate. So, Lori, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, General Collins, and welcome everyone. It is such an honor to be here and to be interviewing Diankha, because we always see each other in the community, but this is the first time I'm actually going to be able to talk to him about his service and his experience with the Nisei vets. First question, though, what does Nisei mean?
Well, Nisei means the second generation Japanese Americans here in the United States. The first were the immigrants, their parents, called Iseis. Then the Niseis, their children, and the Nisei's children would be called Sansei, or third generation. As far as I know, we're the only racial group that keeps track of the generations that way, but you'll see that name quite often, Nisei, second generation.
Tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to be in the Army.
Actually, when the war started, we were living in San Jose, California, and as most of you know, the Japanese Americans were evacuated from the West Coast, but there was a window where if you had some sponsor or relative that lived off the coast, you could actually go and live in those areas. So my parents, along with relatives and friends in San Jose, California, decided in 72 hours they had to move off of their farm. So they moved to Utah, so that's where I kind of grew up. And then from there, in 1944, we moved to Idaho, and then find the Moses Lake. So I grew up in Moses Lake High School, went to school at Washington State University. And in those days, that was about 55 years ago, in those days, every boy had to take ROTC for 2 years. So I took 2 years ROTC, and I extended 2 more years and graduated with a commission. And after training, I spent the early Vietnam War in Thailand in the Corps of Engineers, building an air base and highways to support the war in Vietnam.
So tell me a little bit about the NVC, the Nisei vets themselves. They are historically the most decorated military unit in U.S. Army history. Tell us a little bit about what makes these particular group of veterans so special.
Well, let me go back in the history of the 442nd. Like Jimmy was saying, before Pearl Harbor, there were quite a few Japanese Americans in the military. But after December 7, 1941, they were stripped of their rifles and they were declared enemy aliens. But about 6 months later, the Army decided they needed some soldiers, so they decided to form a segregated Army battalion in Hawaii. And they asked for volunteers, and they thought they'd get maybe a couple hundred volunteers, but 10,000 Hawaiians stepped forward to volunteer. And out of that group, 1,500 were sent to Mississippi for training. And this was in 1942. And after a few months of training, the Army decided to form a larger organization, which ultimately became the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which consisted of volunteers from Hawaii and volunteers from the internment camps here in the United States. And in 1943, then the 100th Battalion was declared ready for combat, but there weren't any generals around that wanted the Japanese Americans. So General Mark Clark reluctantly accepted them, and they went first to North Africa, and then they were moved to Italy to fight for the first combat for the push into Rome. And about that time, in 1944, the rest of the unit, the 442nd, was declared ready for combat, and they were moved to Italy, and they joined up with the 100th Battalion for the push into Italy, France, and then Germany. And they became one of the most decorated units in U.S. history.
I want to explain for those of you who may not be quite familiar that in 1942, so this is the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, which put 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast into these American concentration camps. Minidoka is where many of our friends and relatives ended up here from the Seattle area. And so this is the United States government that removed all of these people from the West Coast, their homes, their businesses, and locked them up behind barbed wire in terrible conditions, going into these camps and asking them to volunteer to serve, to volunteer to go into combat. And the response from these camps was tremendous. You know, from Minidoka alone, more than 2,000 young men volunteered for the U.S. Army. And they knew they were going into a segregated unit. They knew that they were not favored in the eyes of the U.S. public. They were still suspicious because they looked like the enemy. And yet they, I think, felt that they had to prove their loyalty with their own blood. And it was their parents who even encouraged them. You will fight for your country. This is your country. You will fight for your country. So it was pretty, excuse the expression, ballsy move by the government to ask these fellows to come forth, and yet they did.
You have to remember there were two segregated units in the U.S. Army during World War II. The first one was the Japanese Americans in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the other one was the African Americans in the 92nd Infantry Division. And they were all commanded by Caucasian officers for the duration of the war, although there were some battlefield commissions given, so they fought through all of that also.
We talked about the heroism of the 442nd RG Regimental Combat Team, RCT. Tell us about one particular battle, the Gothic Line.
Soon after the 442nd was declared combat ready, they were sent to Italy, and one of the first battles was a battle in northern Italy, and there was a large mountain range in northern Italy, and it protected the Po Valley, which in turn led directly into Germany. So Germans had a very strong defensive position in the hills in northern Italy. And so one of the first battles for the 442nd was to try to beat back the Germans and gain those mountains. And after about 2 months, they decided to send the 442nd to France to fight there. And after about 4 or 5 months, they sent the 442nd back to the same area, and they said, "Are you guys still fighting this war?" So anyway, they were sent back after 6 months of fighting in the Gothic Line. The plan was to climb up the mountainside overnight and overrun the Germans' positions in the Po Valley. So what they did, it took 8 hours to climb up Mount Fogarito, which was behind the German lines. And they were saying that they couldn't make any noise. If you fell off the mountains, you couldn't even scream. You just had to fall. But they did, after 8 hours, early in the morning, were able to overrun the German lines in a matter of 30 or 40 minutes. And that took the Gothic Line. And from there, the U.S. Army was able to go into Germany. Of course, the war was just about over at that time.
It was amazing because these are very sheer cliffs. These are granite cliffs that go up basically 90 degrees. And there were instances where people fell but could not scream. We only have about a minute, but I also wanted to talk about the Military Intelligence Service as an arm of this regimental combat team.
That's right. And there are about 14,000 who served in the 442nd, but there was another group of Japanese Americans who acted as translators and interpreters in the Pacific War. And they helped the U.S. military to crack the Japanese war codes. And they were credited with intercepting a message that sent American fighters up to shoot down the plane that was carrying the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto. And he was the admiral who planned the Pearl Harbor attack. So that was a big turning point in the war. And ultimately, 6,000 Japanese Americans served in the military intelligence. And they were very instrumental in rebuilding post-war Japan.
So to wrap up, and you may have earlier seen the photo of President Truman with the troops. It was President Truman who attributed the quick conclusion of the Pacific War, in particular, to the skill and the talent of the Military Intelligence Service and Japanese American service members in general for helping speed up the conclusion of World War II. So, Dale, Kaku, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Laurie.
Laurie and Dale, thank you so much for helping share that piece of history and the local connection for those of us that maybe might even have been in Seattle several years, but we don't know a lot of the background. That's terrific. One of the things that I learned, when I joined the Army out of ROTC, it was still the conscription Army. I was a volunteer, as Dale, I think, mentioned we were all in ROTC. But I learned, even though we had a conscription force for a few years, we transitioned to the all-volunteer force. And one of the things that I learned was that we depend on families to not only support us as we go about our work, but to help us stay in uniform. So because our armed forces are a family business, I'd really like to focus for just a moment on family, and let's begin with a really special category of individuals, those who have lost loved ones, members of their family. We call them Gold Star family members. Could we have our Gold Star family members please stand and be recognized? Thank you. The next category I'd like to recognize is spouses. If you have been a spouse of a uniformed service member, please stand. If you've been a mom, dad, or a sibling of a uniformed service member, also please stand. So I think it's fair to say that we got a lot of family here in the room, and we're delighted to have you here. What I'd like to do now is just briefly talk about our Rotary Club of Seattle members who have served in the armed forces. And we know we have others, but this is the representative group, and I'll introduce them in order of how far back they began their service. I'm not going to talk about age, okay? So first we have Jerry A. Costacos, who served in the United States Navy and in World War II, and we're delighted to have you representing the Navy, Jerry.
I'm glad to be alive.
We'd like to introduce past President Karl who represents the United States Marine Corps.
Put your hand up. Glad to be alive.
He's reluctant to put his hand up. And we have Skip Rowland, former airman, and we have Diankha Lanier, former soldier. In the next few minutes, you'll learn more about them and their military experience. Lori, we turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, General. Let's start with, at the very end there, Karl Egge. Please tell us a little bit about how you came to become part of the military, and what was it like when you were serving?
Well, I think it's important to reflect about the time when I grew up. I was born just before World War II started, and I remember the celebrations at the end of World War II as a young boy. Every male member of my father and mother's family, including my father, served in the United States military or in government service during World War II. My two grandfathers, one Irish, one German, also served at the time, either World War I, but my other Irish grandfather served in the British Navy in 1899 to 1903. So I had a strong military family background. There was no question in my mind that at some point in time I was going to serve in the military. I felt as a son of immigrants and the joy of living in the United States and fighting for the freedoms that we all know and cherish, that it was part of my duty and obligation as a citizen. I had three options for university. I had an appointment to the Naval Academy, to the Air Force Academy, and a Navy ROTC scholarship at Princeton, which I took, and then decided to take an option instead of going to the Navy. Sorry, Jerry. I kept hitting my head on overhead in the ships. It was a little too tall. I took an option to take an appointment as a lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. I made that decision in 1962 when things were a little bit quiet. By the time I graduated in 1965, things were a little hotter. And I found myself a year later in Vietnam with an infantry outfit as an artillery forward observer, and I served there for 13 months, mostly in what the area they call I Corps, which is from sort of Quang Ngai north to the DMZ Most of my time was spent in Quang Tri province. I've done a lot of work with Peace Trees Vietnam in trying to restore some humanity to that part of that country. After serving in Vietnam, I came back to the United States and was given what used to be a plum position as a college recruiter. How many of you were in university in 1967 to 1970? Well, I was the guy in my dress blue uniform would come on the campus and say, why don't you young men, mostly at the time, join the Marine Corps and go fight in Vietnam? I was not well received, to say the least. Suffice it to say, I owe the country owes me perhaps, but I owe the country much. I received my undergraduate degree. I have a master's in business and a law degree, all paid with the GI Bill benefits. I have, tried to live a life to give back, not just to society, but to the country that gave me the education opportunities that my grandparents thought possible when they emigrated to the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Okay,
so that's
thank
my
you.
story, and I'll stick with it.
Thank you very much.
Good job.
Jerry, and if you could also maybe talk a little bit about what, no, go ahead. Tell us how you came to be in the military and what was it like?
I was in high school when Pearl Harbor broke out, and we all knew we were going to go into the service at one time or another. So shortly after I graduated from West Seattle High School in 1944, while I was still 17 years of age, I enlisted in the Navy. I wasn't sure I could pass the eye test, so in those days they told us drink a lot of carrot juice. So for months on end, I drank a quart of carrot juice a day, and I passed the eye test with flying colors. And yes, my skin was a little orange, Karl. So I enlisted in the Navy. I went to boot camp in Farragut, Idaho. I was transferred to Bremerton, Washington. I served to a ship that was originally sunk at Pearl Harbor, the USS California. And I went out to the combat zone, and just before the combat zone, they took me off the guns and they put me to do payroll work. And so that was a nice cuss job when we were not in combat. But my first baptism under fire was in Okinawa. I was an 18-year-old kid. I was scared, I don't mind telling you. It wasn't fun, but we mopped up Okinawa. We went and had some skirmishes in the East China Sea, and then we went down to the Philippines to paint our ship a darker color because we were going to bombard northern Japan with a place called Paramushiro. Our ship was 20 years old when it was sunk at Pearl Harbor. And so we were with the slower fleet, and we started painting the ship a darker gray. The Navy only has one color. Admiral, where are you? But we had two colors in those days, a darker color when we were going to go up in northern Japan. Well, the war ended when we were in the Philippines and went back up, secured Okinawa and secured the Japanese mainland. It was very peaceful. It was a very peaceful transition. And shortly after that, I was on my way back to the United States by going around the world.
Thank you. That's awesome. Skip.
Well, okay, so my ancestors came to this country in 1619, and they weren't on tour. Right. So by the time I came along, there were a couple of points that had to be made. First of all, there's a difference between being a citizen and an American. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, you don't have to say it loud, just say it. So I wanted to be an American. And in the company that I was keeping, it would be hard to be an American without serving in the military. So as a prep school kid, that means that you know, I went to very, very, very well-organized schools. I went to Howard right out of high school. We understood the Mbemfu. We understood the Dead Sea Scrolls. We understood all of the various questions and answers around Vietnam. But what we had to answer was, where were we going to be in 2017? And I decided in 1967, when I went into the service, that in 2017, I wanted to be on the stage at the downtown Rotary. And yeah, and I wanted to be a member in good standing. That's all I wanted to be. I didn't want to be president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. I wanted to be a member in good standing and to be able to look everybody in the eye and say, you cannot deny my American citizenship, nor can you deny that when called, I answered, even though I didn't agree with it, I didn't think it was right, but as an American, I fought, and it was 12 of the sweetest years I ever had in my life.
Diankha.
My experience was a little bit different. I joined I joined in 1991 in the military, although there are definitely some consistencies. My grandfather and my father were both military soldiers. There was no expectation for me to join, and I think there was shock and appall when I told everyone I was going to join based on my high school years. And I really joined as a Gen X person initially for college money. Right? We didn't have a ton of money at our house. I grew up in High Point in West Seattle. I grew up in Ondale Ridge, so we didn't have a lot of money. And the Army was a way to actually break some barriers and have an opportunity to be educated. So, I was at Howard University when I was notified that I actually forgot to fill out the financial forms. So I had to figure out how I was going to pay for college. And I walked down the street on Georgia Avenue, if you're familiar with DC, and joined the Army. I didn't even know they yelled at people in the Army. And 16 years later, and by the way, similar to Karl, when I joined, I was assuming it would be sort of you get your money, you go to school, you do a little, Desert Storm popped up right as I joined, so I thought I was joining the reserve and ended up on active duty special work for a few years while I was in DC. But I had 16 years of the best years of my life. I learned about responsibility, and to Skip's point, I learned about being an American. I love the country, I love the people, honestly for me, much more than I think I could have appreciated. I was selected as one of 2 cadets in my class to go to airborne school. I was a civil affairs officer, an aide de camp for a battalion commander, and then ended up working on Army boats, and ultimately became a JAG officer. And it's been probably the best experience, but most of all, I love that when that flag goes up, I feel deeply connected to this country.
Okay, I'm going to go the same direction. Thank you very much. So Diankha, you make an interesting point, the Gen X generation. Tell us about how you separated from the Army. Interesting moment.
Yeah, so I really connect with everyone and everyone's family that was in the military. I'd served for 16 years. I think I had some of the best OERs, officer evaluation ratings, I think anyone could have. I thought I'd be a general, frankly, in the military like Jimmy. But I got pregnant for the first time. I was in my mid-30s, I'd waited. And then I was told, though, that when my daughter was 4 months after I'd given birth, that I would have to sign custody over to someone else while I went over to Afghanistan, because of course, I was a lawyer, so I understood this. If something were to happen to me, the Army didn't want to deal with the paperwork. So I left the military much earlier than I had planned, because there are sacrifices that military soldiers had to make. I chose family, but I also appreciate that there are thousands and thousands of people that make different choices than I did.
Okay. How has your military experience, and this is for the other folks too, how has the military experience affected your life today? What did you learn in the military that applies to your life today?
I learned about power. Naked power. When you fly into as many air bases that I flew into, you get to see how vast the power of the United States is. When you see row after row after row after row of B-52s, and then row after row after row of KC-135s, and you land and see row after row after row of 106s, full complement of people to take care of them, Marines on the perimeter, Army just inside, Air Police walking around, you begin to realize just how powerful the United States of America is. Thank you. Thank you. More. Come on, I'm talking about your country. And I'm going to tell you, I was very proud to be a part of that. I wasn't, I'm not a victim. And I wasn't going to be a victim. And when I looked out and saw that power, I realized no one in our country need be victimized if they first capture the power of their own mind.
Okay. We have 4 minutes, so between the two of you, 4 minutes.
What I learned in the military is respect for my elders. I learned respect for other human beings because I dealt with human beings that hadn't been to school. I did payroll work, and you had one fellow that didn't know how to, totally illiterate, and he signed his payroll chit with an X. And I learned to respect him as much as I did with the college graduates. I learned to respect my country, which I love beyond what you can imagine. And I learned to realize that the United States is the best place in the world to live. And all I can say is God bless America.
I would agree with everything that's been said. Some of the valuable lessons I learned from the military was the value of teamwork. No one serves in the military alone, especially when you're in a combat situation. The people on your left and on the right, and the ones behind, and the ones in front, those are the ones that you rely on. You rely on each other. You really are a band of brothers, with all due respect, brothers and sisters today. But in those days, let's say, a band of brothers. The value of teamwork. You also begin to understand the value of what true leadership is. Leaders don't dictate. Leaders earn the respect of those who serve with them. And you see how and why certain people rise to leadership, and it helps you to cast your own life in a way where you demonstrate leadership. You don't demand it. You earn it. And that's probably the one true thing that I learned as an officer in the Marine Corps.
All right. I'd like to thank our panelists very much for your time and your expertise. Stand up, everybody. Thank you to all our veterans.
I wish that Admiral Tom Hayward were here today, our member, as the former Chief of Naval Operations. I mean, he was the top enlisted person in the U.S. Navy. He's our member. And an amazing veteran, an amazing example, citizen of our community. So my thoughts are with Tom. He couldn't be here today, but what an amazing guy. I'm so honored that we got to learn more about the veterans in our club today, also about the Nisei veterans. We civilians will really never truly know what you experienced. There's no way. We will never know how hard it was to do what you did. We will never know what it's like to deal with the aftermath of combat and service. But that said, I know that I speak for all of us when I simply say thank you. Thank you for wanting to serve, for risking your life and safety and well-being to ensure the freedoms that we all enjoy. Without you, there is no America. Yeah. Without you, there is no freedom. And there is truly no way to put a price on what you have done for us. But know this, that we carry with us in our hearts the gift that you've given us through your service to our country. When you think about it, military service is the most profound act there is of service above self. When you think about it, that's our motto as Rotarians, and you embody that at the very highest level. So thank you.